Hi, everybody. I'm Walter. I'm the Dutch Mentor, and welcome back to the S.M.A.R.T Performance Podcast, where S stands for self-care, M for mindful growth, A for adaptive problem solving, R for rhythmic operation, T for building that very important thriving community, and of course, P for performance. I'm really happy to have Ryan here today because he's going to dive into a topic that we all should be paying attention. As you know, I talk about intentional leadership, and loving the people that you lead means that you need to get to know the people. Well, let me tell you something. And Gen X, Y, Z, M, and whatever else comes with it, will all need something just a little different to be motivated. And that will be the topic of today. As promised, 15 minutes of very intentional conversation with actionable takeaways. Ryan Vett, thank you very much for being here this morning, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Walter, thanks so much for having me. My background is I spent a lot of time in venture-backed startups. And after about 20 years of that, I decided to hang up my hat after an exit and really focus on generations. Where have we been as society and where are we going as a society and a planet? I had been a part early, about 15 years ago, in artificial intelligence startups and other companies, and was really seeing quick technological advancements and seeing how different generations in the workplace and in culture and society were handling each of those advancements differently, and how underneath all of that, there's a communication barrier that is currently costing U.S. workforce about $1.2 trillion a year in poor communication. And I said, you know what? After I left that life behind, I said I want to take everything I learned and really focus now on writing and speaking across the world on the different generations and what that means for us as leaders in our workplaces today.
I think it is such an important topic, and I've experienced this along the way myself, of course, is that it is when you sit in front of people and you really cannot, or you don't take the time to understand it and the world from their perspective, from their, walking a mile in their shoes, so to speak, you're often going to miss out. So give me a business case scenario where you have experience working with different generations in order to be able to get something done, and you made a mistake. And the hard way of learning is probably the best, is by making, by failing from time to time.
Yeah, making a mistake is always a great way to learn. I think for me, when I first got started, I had the opportunity and was really blessed to start young in my career as an early teenager, and just so happened to have a company that did well at that point in time. And so I was young. I was one of the earlier millennials working in the workforce, and everyone was asking what's wrong with millennials these days. And so I had to figure out how to use what made my generation different, how to use that effectively to lead up and lead across. And I think one of the most practical examples and one of the things I look at so often is what I call the generational prism. And I think this is one of the best tools that you can take home today, right now, and look through. The prism, like a prism, is triangular or a pyramid. And when light's refracted through it, it creates a rainbow or some hue of color. So often we start with the rainbow and say it's a millennial, it's a Gen Z, and then we try to figure out everything else instead of starting with what I call the two other sides of that prism. That would be the age and the moment. Let me give you a concrete example that will help make this practical today. When I first started in the workforce, everyone said millennials hopped jobs. They were job hoppers. They couldn't stay loyal to a workforce. And now we're saying the same thing of Gen Z. And so I took a longitudinal study that goes all the way back to the 1950s and looked at every generation and said, okay, when baby boomers were 25 years old, how many times had they switched jobs? Did the same question for Gen X and millennials. And what I found was that with baby boomers, it was about 5.3 times. With Gen X, it was also about 5.3 times. And so with millennials, it was only 5.6. Statistically speaking, they weren't switching jobs more. So why did it feel that way? And this is where I think leaders sometimes make mistakes, is because we assume that because something feels to be true at that exact moment in time, we get sidetracked and say millennials are job hoppers. The reality is that's the age, 25. You have to look at the moment, that side of the prism. The moment when baby boomers were growing up is there was almost no child labor laws. So they were working at age 10 or 11, and they hopped jobs 5.3 times over a decade and a half. Gen X, there were some labor laws. So you're looking at 14 or 15 being the first average job. They still hopped jobs 5.3 times in 10 years. Millennials, with the majority going to college, the average age of first job was 19 years old, and they did that in about 6 years. So it felt faster. And I use that as one of many examples because so often we label the generation first, and then we start to look through that stereotype. It's like the selective attention bias. It's the study where they put a gorilla on a x-ray and had professional radiologists interpret the x-ray and say, count how many nodes or nodules there are. They missed the picture of the gorilla on the x-ray. Professionals, people that are diagnosing you because they were so focused on counting the nodes. And I think sometimes we do the same exact thing when we go into a generational workplace, and we automatically attach a label that may or may not be true.
So it's so interesting to look at that, and it's certainly from because people base a lot of their feelings on assumptions and what they've been taught without actually really looking into it. One of my most interesting experiences was with there was a senior leadership role, and we hired a new communication marketing director, young 23, 24-year-old, little whippersnapper, right? It's like let's see what we can teach her. And after in the first meeting, she says, "I cannot wait to teach you." And I looked at myself, it's like, well, what in the world? You still wet behind the ears. What in the world? But you know what? She opened up our eyes that we have to really think about it. I started with computers, right? The Commodore 64 and working with floppy disk drives. But that today, for them, they grew up with advanced iPads and technology that I barely can wrap my head around. And the thing is that we, as more senior leader people, need to open up our eyes and minds to the next generation. So talk a little bit about that, the generational differences that you have seen, and why it is so important for leaders to take a step back and say, listen, I don't know it all, and I do need to surround myself by those people who have become, computer age has become an extension of their being.
Yeah, the extension of the being has happened to every generation. Every generation is lazier than the last one, right? Because silent generation, when their kids went to the white collar air conditioned office, they're like, oh, they're lazy. And then baby boomers, when they had kids and they had typewriters and maybe computers, they're lazy. And then millennials on their phone, then Gen Z, they're just speaking to AI and it's doing their work for them. So I think what you have shared is a common experience. And we always say the next generation is lazy. They just work more efficiently. Doesn't mean the quality is the same, and that's a much larger discussion for another time. But I think what we need to look at with the younger generation is what unique skills and experiences do they bring that, frankly, you and I can't have experience because of when we were born, what we were raised during, and things like that. There's a lot of benefit to that, with whether that's more technology literate or more willing to try new technologies. But at the same time, there's a significant communication barrier too, because they look at the world differently. They receive feedback differently. Feedback, often to a Gen Z, and we're generalizing for the sake of time, can be devastating. That can ruin their day, their week, or they just won't show up the next day at work because you gave what you could give any other generation, constructive feedback, and they would take it and improve. Gen Z can't take that. So we do have to look at not only the technology, but how does each person communicate? What's important to them? Why do they want to work? Are they working just to get a paycheck, which we know most entry level jobs, that's why they take it, or are they working for a purpose? And study after study is actually showing Gen Z wants to work for an organization, for profit or nonprofit, that promotes a bigger value than themselves, that has a big idea, that has forward looking vision, and that should be really encouraging. Sometimes the simplest thing is leaders just need to lead again. We got into the habit of managing behaviors and tasks and everything else that we forgot what leading is. It's casting vision and walking forward so that other people want to follow.
Yeah, and that's exactly the reason why I left corporate world to go into leadership behavior piece of it. Is that when I ask people, what do you do? Is, well, I manage people. So, well, right there, you're wrong. We manage process and we lead people,
There you
and
go.
you better understand how you can lead individuals on teams and teams in order to bring the very best out of them. So, I think we've established that we cannot treat everybody the same, right? And each person, based on experience and age and background, bring a unique aspect to work, and it's the leader's responsibility to bring that to out and really optimize and maximize the performance of that. So become a little bit more practical. How would a leader make that assessment? What steps do they need to take the blinders off and to be more open minded and to really get the full benefit of that?
I think there's many different ways, and I think one of the things you just said is actually the key. It's We can't have this blanket leadership. It's not one size fits all. If you have kids, you know that your first child is radically different than your second child, than your third child. They're radically different. You cannot parent them the same way because it won't work. And somehow, some way, in corporate America, we and business as a whole, we became robotic in the way we manage, and it is management. We have forgotten leadership. That yes, to lead a team, you can have a unified vision and a unified purpose value. That's great, but when it comes down to interacting with the individual, you need to understand where they're at, and you need to get to know them. A practical cross generational way that I find so fun is if you have a team around a round table or you're in a boardroom, especially if it's a multi-generational team, ask, hey, when you were in ninth grade, starting high school, what was the latest greatest tech gadget that you wanted? Or what was the number one song that it reminds you of your driving the car with the windows down? And those things, as simple as they sound, all of a sudden say, hey, they had those same memories. They were so excited when the Walkman came out, or the iPod Shuffle, or the latest greatest thing. And it starts to allow this really simple communication that shows, hey, we're radically different. We grew up in different eras with different technology. Some generations weren't allowed to leave the house without a leash and without monitoring and tracking devices in both their shoes and their backpack. Other generations could go ride their bike forever as long as they were home by the time the street lights came on. And so you start to see, like, hey, what did you do after school? And there's some of those questions that I provide on my website. They're free, just to help you start some of those simple conversations to bring the human back into leadership.
I love that. Actually, it makes me think about, for me, it was the Walkman. And we had a yellow Walkman, and we were so cool because we had a headset that had not the soft pads, but actually went into your ears a little bit. And we were the coolest kids on the block to have that.
Yeah.
My kids are laughing about that today, of course. I think it's so very relevant, and that's the reason why I'm a big promoter of situational leadership, that you really need to adjust yourself to the person that's in front of you, the team that you lead, because we don't manage people, of course. So taking that conversation a good starting point for somebody is to open up their mind and become more mindful about how to become that effective leader and the behaviors that go into it. So tell me a little bit about what is it you have on your website? What is it that you're trying to do with people today to help them cross that prism and really become more effective?
Yeah. Every single week, I publish an essay between 1,200 words and 2,000 words. It's like a small book chapter, and it's thoroughly researched. It's looking at cultural trends and what's going on in the world. Everything from things like the Great Wealth Transfer and how that's going to impact next generations, to what I call the barbell generation, Gen X, and why Gen X isn't in leadership roles like the previous generations. Even in politics, if you look at it, in the White House, we haven't seen Gen X. We've seen boomers and we've seen millennials, but why is a generation missing? And in Congress, we're seeing a large void of Gen X. Not that they're absent, but they're statistically significantly lower. So topics like that, to communication barriers. What are the leading communication barriers? It's a free resource, free tool, and I just put that out there for people to learn how to lead across generations, because it is costing teams not just cash, which is important, and productivity, but it's costing trust and that human relationship. And as we move into a world and a society and an era where we continually depend on machines and AI and other things to do a lot of the legwork for us, we're losing some of that humanness in leadership. And at the core, leadership is leading other humans. It's interacting at a human level. And so I always try to bring that back and help kind of provide a cultural mirror as where we are today, where we're going, and what you can do with it.
So it's funny you say that, 12 to 1,500 words, 1,800 words, that, listen, you're missing the ball. You're missing the mark, because who even reads anymore, right? Unless it's in 143 or 286 characters, nobody goes beyond it. But I strongly encourage, and will be in the show link, people should make it a habit to read more, right? Is that you talked about the critical failure points in business today, and I always teach, and I teach at Rutgers University, or my clients too, is that there are three things that, the three most common failure points is the failure to communicate, and failure to communicate. And they say, why is that? What is that? So talk a little bit, I was going to ask the question on why this is important, but you already answered that. But talk a little bit about the communication piece and why that is such a critical link, and why that is so very different between, the generations.
Yeah, from a linguistic standpoint, which is really interesting, I think there's a barrier there. Often older generations, more mature generations, even one removed. So I'm a millennial, and I'm talking about Gen Z and Gen Alpha now. They have different phrases and words, and I remember I was speaking to high schoolers, which I normally speak to corporate executives and associations, and so I reached out to someone that I know that works with high schoolers. I said, "How do I relate to them?" He said, "Whatever you do, do not try to use cool words." And I said, okay. And I think that's what leaders are doing, though. We're trying to relate by being like them. And yet, at some point we were kids too, and we were using, whether you're in the 70s using groovy and all of that or rad, we have these words and vernacular that evolve over time. But communication help bring people along and help bring people up. Don't go backwards to them. Not that there's anything wrong with their 6'7", and all your Gen Alpha listeners just went crazy. Whatever those things are, and say, hey, here's our communication. I think in a corporate workplace, I've said it a couple times, but I'll say it even more explicitly. If you don't have a vision and a values that you repeat so much so that your team starts making fun of you for saying the same phrases over and over and over again, then I think there's actually a problem. I
Yeah.
think you need to have such a crystal clear mission that anyone in your company can say it, and it doesn't have to be verbatim, but knows the gist of it. And it's just something. There's one client I work with, and he has this phrase, and I won't say it because it'll identify who he is, but he has this phrase that he uses over and over and over again, at least like in every email, at least twice, and in every time he's in front of his team, and his team like makes memes and posters. And I was like, does that bother you? He's like, no, because I'm leading well and they know what I stand for. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to know where we're going and always focus on that, and people will follow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny because my theme is in 15 minutes a day you too can be, and it is so very true. Now I need to follow that up, but because everybody has 15 minutes, everybody can do that. It's the behavior to do it consistently, and that really requires measurement and accountability of self or with the body in order to make the difference that we need to make. Listen, I love this conversation. You are a great orator, by the way. Just give you a little shout out.
Thank you.
Your linguistic skills are superb compared to a lot of people I speak to. So I really enjoy that as a foreigner, English being my second language. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm super easy to find. I appreciate the compliment too, Walter. Super easy to find at ryanvet.com, ryanvet.com. And you can find all my social channels on there. Follow me on LinkedIn, YouTube. I've got the Ryan Vet Show if you don't like to read. Every Thursday, my essay comes out, and it averages about 9 minutes in a narrated form. So if you're like me who doesn't like to read, I just like to write, then you can listen to that too. And we all have the time to do it. And I think it's really important, whether it's that newsletter or something else, just get in the habit of just enhancing your leadership skills, like listening to this podcast.
Yeah, listen, in 15 minutes a day of between reading, watching, and participating, I think you can really make a difference for yourself and the people that you lead, for sure. A parting thought.
Yeah, I think parting thought for our leaders. I've already said know where you're going, and that's so important. A story that I have with my oldest son. He wasn't listening and getting ready for bed, and so I turned it into a competition. He's fiercely competitive. No idea where he gets that from. And I said, "I'll race you up the stairs." And so he starts running up the stairs, and he kept looking over his shoulder at me. And so I decided this was an opportune parenting moment. I ran right past him into his room, won the race, and I'm sitting on his bed, and he comes in all upset. "Why did you win?" And I said this. I said, "Buddy, because you were so focused on what I was doing, looking over your shoulders, you weren't focused on where you're going. And that's why you didn't win." And so with the generational conversation, with communication, as a leader, we have to know where we're going and help use and mentor and bring the next generation along. And the other thing I would say while you do that, put away your phones, put away technology. Have meetings where you don't have phones and computers out. You don't need them. I don't know why we think we need them, but the world's not going to end if we don't have our phones and computers in front of us. Get out those notepads and papers and have meetings face to face again. Do not permit, as a leader, those distractions in your meetings.
Listen, it's just music to my ears. I just had a big speaking engagement highlighted exactly those points. People are missing the marker over and over and over again. It's clarity, focus, purpose, and go back to basics, right? It's like leave things behind and go and get to know the people, find ways to relate, not to compare. And it is amazing what you can develop and create over a period of time. Ryan, thank you very much for joining me on the show today. I really, really appreciate it. And to the audience, and remember, it is fun to listen to these things, and we make it actionable. So there's certain things that I can take away from our conversation, but you too, make sure you do something with it today, and follow through, right? Be consistent. Go to the Apple Store, download the Dutch Mentor mobile app. You'll find guidance in that. Certainly will be helpful in measuring your daily behaviors. Again, Ryan, thank you very much for joining me today. Good luck, and see everybody on the next show. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Take care.